Welcome to International Biorenewables Law and Policy. This presentation is part 2 of our 3-part series on producing biofuels from algae and aviation biofuels. In this presentation, we'll dig a little bit deeper into some of the technical and economic aspects involved in the production of biofuels from algae. We discussed in the first part of this series that algae can be grown in different forms. Particularly, you have open and closed systems that include also fermentation tanks. And you can use these different systems to grow a number of different types of species of algae. But what decisions you make regarding the growth media and the species that you use will impact how productive your algae will be and how expensive your systems might be to operate. This is work that is being done at many locations nationally. I just want to highlight one particular project that's being done here at Iowa State by Professor Ziyu Wen from Food Science. Here on campus, we have an algae grow facility where they're innovating in the harvesting methods of collecting algae. Specifically, what you see here on the bottom left is a algae pond, and the rotors that you see here are machine powered. They're green, the paddles are green, and because the algae, as they go through the paddles, get stuck to those paddles. And what Professor Wen's group has developed is a method where you can take advantage of the stickiness of the algae and attach it to some cloths and essentially scrape the algae from those cloths as they move through the pond. Open ponds, as we discussed earlier, they're very low cost to operate, but because they are exposed to the environment, they often suffer from attacks from other types of algae species, microbes, and other types of bacteria. And so there's poor control on the composition of the media, and that affects the productivity of the algae. Photobioreactors, not shown here, typically involve closed loops that protect the algae media from any external exposure. However, because algae require sunlight in order to grow, photobioreactors present a logistic challenge in the sense that you have to build them vertically as opposed to being able to grow them horizontally. And so they tend to have a higher cost, in part because of that, in part because of the additional materials that you need. But they're certainly better in terms of producing a high quality algae product. We've already mentioned solar irradiation being a particular important factor. Algae production, I'm going to mention this several times, depends on a careful coming together of many different factors. When it comes to climate, solar radiation is an important one. And because you have to have a certain amount of sunlight throughout the year available to the algae, you can see that the region that is most suitable for growing algae is what's highlighted here in blue. And so these are the temperature zones that are projected to be suitable for algae, and they provide an annual average temperature of above 15 degrees Celsius. Anywhere that's too cold, and you will lose a lot of your algae during the frost or periods that are below the suggested temperature range. Okay, so most algae production will be concentrated in this region to become commercial. If you focus on the U.S., in addition to that region down in the south area where you would want to grow the algae, you also have to have sources of CO2. And so what these dots represent are facilities, mostly power plants and other types of plants that emit significant amounts of carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide is what you would need to provide to the algae. Obviously, the closer you are to the facility and the more concentrated that CO2 source is, the more effective it would be to grow the algae. But you can start to see how you have to match the location of the power plant, which wasn't necessarily sited for this particular purpose, with algae, which requires access to the right amount of sunlight, climatic temperature, and water nutrients as well. And so, because of all those factors, we're going to see that algae production is very expensive. We'll see the number here in another slide. And the cost of producing biofuels from algae, the feedstock side, the algae science and biomass production, system infrastructure and integration, harvesting and dewatering, those contribute over 50% of the cost. In fact, the conversion to biofuels is a small portion of the cost. However, the reason the Department of Energy and other international organizations have invested in developing algae since the 70s is because of that tremendous potential for producing biofuels on a small amount of land. And with the appropriate cost reductions and performance improvements, there is some hope that maybe someday algae could be economically competitive. In this presentation, we'll try to see what some of those factors are. So a group at Berkeley published a report, that's the report by Lundquist et al. In 2010, where they looked at 5 particular scenarios. The idea is that you have a pond area of 100 hectares, and you grow algae in that area for different types of markets. You have 2 types of emphasis. So you have a facility where the algae are being used to treat the wastewater from the nearby city or facilities, or you have an emphasis in trying to maximize biofuel production. In either one of those cases, we're going to compare producing primarily a liquid oil for biofuel production, or a biogas for heating and cooling and power generation. Okay. The operation schedule for these different cases varies between year-round and most of the year. Let's look at what the process diagram or the block diagram looks for one of the cases. The idea here is that we're taking wastewater from a nearby city or wastewater facility, and we're running it through some clarifiers and sending it through to our high rate ponds where we're growing the algae. The algae are going to eat up many of the nutrients which we don't want to have mixed into the water for human consumption. And so the treated wastewater can then be sent out to commercial uses. The algae which has grown can be separated in a second clarifier and eventually harvested and sent to a digester. The digester will convert most of the algae into methane and CO2. The methane can be combusted just like natural gas to produce electricity. The solids that are remaining from the anaerobic digester will be recycled back to the ponds because it includes a lot of the nutrients and the minerals that the algae need. And eventually any remaining carbon there will be released as CO2 from the system. So this is a relatively straightforward system. The digester is a relatively simple technology. And so the idea here is that we're taking advantage of the need for wastewater treatment and the availability of a low-cost conversion technology to produce electricity. The alternative is to produce a higher value product, which is the refined oil or the oil for transportation fuels. That scenario can also use wastewater. In this case, you want a more carefully controlled wastewater to send to the algae. With the algae, then you would produce biofuel. You still have a certain amount of carbon that would need to go through a digester to be properly utilized. And so you're still producing a smaller amount of electricity in the scenarios where you produce biofuels. But you can certainly see the similarities and between the 2 different scenarios here. Okay, just as a reminder of what the different cases are, I've added to the table here a column indicating the emphasis and the primary product. So WW stands for wastewater, and BF is for biofuels. And again, the scenarios focus on either oil for biofuel production, biogas for power generation. This table summarizes the results of the report, which I encourage you to read in more detail. And what you can see here is that in the case of oil production, we have a credit that is given for producing the byproduct electricity. That credit can be fairly significant, as in case 5. The biofuel production scenarios tend to have a higher cost than the biogas production scenarios, but we do produce a higher value product. However, when you look at the column of cost production without wastewater treatment credit, you can see that none of these scenarios make a profit. All these numbers are negative. And in the case of the oil production scenarios, case 1, 3, and 5, you can see that we are several times more expensive than the prevailing price of crude oil. So crude oil right now sells for about $40 to $50 a barrel, and so we are not only not making a profit, but it's actually costing us 10 times the cost of oil. In the case of electricity, we're similarly not competitive in either one of the scenarios. In order to get a semblance of competitiveness, we need to get a credit. And so you can see here that they have a generous credit from the wastewater treatment facility in the 2 first scenarios. That makes the biofuel production scenario almost economically viable or economically positive, but it's still losing money. In the case of the biogas scenario, we're finally able to make a profit thanks to that wastewater treatment credit. And so that shows how essential it is not only to have the nutrients that you need, but to have someone that is willing to pay you for the service of cleaning up the water in your facility. All other scenarios here, which have a much lower wastewater treatment credit because we're focusing on producing biofuels and we're using a relatively clean water source, as you can see, fail to be economically viable. There are many different components that play a role into the capital costs, which is fairly high for algae systems. If you have open ponds, so that 100 hectares that we discussed as an assumption in this study contributes about 19 to 20% of the total capital cost of the system. You still need to have some high rate ponds from which you can extract your algae that's fully grown, and that contributes another 14%. So you can see just the facilities to grow the algae contribute near almost a quarter of the cost of the facility, and that doesn't even include any of the other conversion and electrical and other parts, high technical parts of the facility. If we had a photobioreactor, we would need less land, but the costs for growing the algae would be significantly greater than what we have in these studies. In terms of operating costs, we're looking here at just one of the scenarios. You can see the details for the other scenarios. A significant portion of the non-capital costs go towards the facility staff. You need a significant amount of people to help with maintaining the algae facility running and making sure that the ponds are operating like they should, helping with the harvesting, helping with other parts of the facility. And so that happened to be the most expensive part of operating the facility on an annual basis. There is a maintenance charge of 2% of the capital cost. That's fairly typical. When you look at the equipment that we're discussing in these scenarios, they're not particularly complicated, particularly in the biogas production scenarios. But even then, the high capital cost typically means that you're going to have significant expense when you have to replace parts of the system. And so the other costs are certainly relatively small compared to these. But to put things in perspective, the capital charge, this is the annual expense that you have from operating the facility, depreciation, financing, interest, and investment, is still higher than all these other operating costs. And so your total cost per year, that estimate about $5.3 million per year for this 100 hectare facility. And that's what brings up the cost of producing the biofuel to $400 and almost $420 per barrel. Too expensive to compete with today's petroleum cost. So to summarize this, in order for algae biofuels to be competitive, you need to have a facility that carefully considers multiple factors: climate, geography, resources, and a suite of policy and incentive considerations. We've looked at a report where they tried to use wastewater treatment as a scenario or a strategy to reduce the cost of biofuels. We see that in some cases it can be a significant advantage, but for the most part, none of these scenarios appear to be competitive with today's fuel prices. And so even when we consider finding the optimal locations and having tipping fees or incentives that help, algae biofuels are one particular type of fuels that will be expensive and remains expensive moving forward.